Throughout this series, we have explored spiritual identity, racism, power, fragmentation, and the hidden mechanics of control. And before moving further, something must be made unmistakably clear. Although this exploration frequently speaks about racism, whiteness, and large-scale systemic structure for extraction, we are not refuting that prejudice, bias, tribalism, and exclusionary dynamics exist at micro levels in some human communities. No group stands outside the human condition. No identity structure is immune to fragmentation. No culture is incapable of constructing hierarchies, boundaries, or superiority narratives. Racism, however, is not merely prejudice. It is not simply interpersonal dislike. It is not reducible to individual bias. Racism is a global system, a psychological, economic, and symbolic order that shapes perception, access, mobility, and power distribution on a planetary scale. And this is precisely why it must be examined differently. Not only morally, not only historically, but structurally, psychologically, energetically. Earlier, we examined a progression of inner fragmentation, from narcissistic instability to psychopathic detachment to the transhumanist impulse of existential escapism. Now we encounter the larger question: how do these inner structures scale into systems? How does fragmentation become governance? Power in its most distilled form is the capacity to shape reality, to influence perception, to control resources, to define meaning, to establish hierarchy. But power derived from coherence operates very differently than power derived from fragmentation. Coherent power stabilizes through integration. Fragmented power stabilizes through control and dominance. When inner stability is weak, dominance becomes compensation. When identity feels fragile, superiority becomes necessity. When relational grounding collapses, hierarchy becomes regulation. This is where elitism enters. Elitism is rarely framed as psychological phenomenon. It is presented as merit, as excellence, as refinement, as superiority justified by performance, wealth, intellect, lineage, or capacity. Yet beneath these narratives lies a familiar structure: comparative identity stabilization. Elitism functions through differentiation, through the creation of symbolic distance between above and below, between superior and inferior, between worthy and lesser. Superiority becomes psychological architecture. Hierarchy becomes an emotional regulation system. And because superiority requires contrast, inferiority must be continuously manufactured. Racism emerges as one of history's most efficient instruments of hierarchical stabilization. Unlike temporary status markers, race-based differentiation operates with extraordinary durability. It embeds into identity, into biology narratives, into culture, into law, into economics, into perception itself. Race becomes a master variable, a sorting mechanism so deeply internalized that hierarchy feels natural rather than constructed. But racism is not sustained by hatred alone. Hatred is volatile. Hatred is unstable. Hatred requires constant emotional fuel. Racism is stabilized through something far more psychologically sophisticated: superiority and inferiority complexes. Superiority and inferiority are not merely social attitudes. They are regulatory mechanisms. In fragmented psyches, superiority compensates for instability. Inferiority becomes a projected shadow. The narcissist inflates to escape inner insufficiency. The psychopath detaches to escape emotional and inner vulnerability. Both require distance from perceived weakness. Racism operationalizes this dynamic at scale. It assigns superiority structurally. It distributes inferiority systematically. It provides entire populations with identity scaffolding built upon comparative valuation. Not simply different, but better and lesser. And here lies the trickster and the craftiness of the system. Everyone becomes psychologically invested. Those assigned superiority stabilize identity through inherited elevation. Those assigned inferiority struggle against imposed destabilization. Intermediate groups are woven into layered hierarchies, multiple nodes of comparison, multiple gradients of above and below. Because a global control system cannot function through a single hierarchy alone. It requires a network of comparative identities. Seen through interculture codes, racism reveals itself not merely as moral failure, but as fragmentation scaled into civilization, a planetary projection of unresolved psychological dynamics. Superiority as stabilization, inferiority as displacement, hierarchy as regulation. The same mechanisms observed in narcissistic and psychopathic structures, reproduced across institutions, economies, and cultural narratives. Control becomes coherence substitute, dominance becomes stability substitute, extraction becomes entitlement substitute. This explains a deeply perplexing phenomenon: why racism persists even when intellectually challenged, even when morally condemned, even when visibly destructive. Because racism is not only ideological, it is regulatory. It stabilizes identity structures. It stabilizes power distributions. It stabilizes psychological hierarchies. Dismantling racism is not merely policy adjustment. It is destabilization of identity scaffolding. It threatens superiority-based self-concepts. It disrupts comparative regulation systems. It exposes the fragility of hierarchies long mistaken for natural order. And fragmented systems resist destabilization instinctively. Racism, then, operates as a master control game, not simply through oppression, but through perception design, identity conditioning, emotional regulation manipulation, comparative belonging systems, reward structures, access systems, narrative reinforcement. Everyone becomes positioned. Everyone becomes sorted. Everyone becomes psychologically located within hierarchy. And once identity fuses with position, defense becomes inevitable. The interculture mechanic sense. Superiority complex is not strength, it is compensation. Inferiority complex is not truth, it is assignment. Hierarchy, when rooted in fragmentation, is not order. It is regulation through perceived comparison. Identity anchored internally cannot be manipulated through comparative valuation. And here lies the deeper liberation quietly hidden beneath this entire series. Racism survives through fragmented identity structures, through superiority needs, through inferiority wounds, through comparative self-concepts. When identity stabilizes internally, superiority complexes loses necessity, inferiority complexes loses authority. Hierarchy derived from such complexes loses psychological grip.